Hi, Serena. Can you hear me okay? Serena, if you can hear me, I see that you're muted.
Yes, I can hear you.
How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing fine. Can you see me?
I can, yes. I'm going to have my camera off. You're welcome to have yours on or off.
I will also make it off. Yes,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are waiting for your presentation and
Yep.
learn.
You're the first one in. Scheduled to start in a couple minutes, so we'll give some people a chance to walk or show up, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I remember I registered for a series of your presentations.
Yep. So this is the first of 4. Yeah, there'll be one each month during the fall semester, and they're all sort of themed. We'll kind of touch on that actually a little bit early in the presentation. So
Okay, nice. Thank you very much.
yeah, hopefully it's hopefully it's helpful.
It will definitely helpful. I think each teacher should learn. The topics
Yeah, I'm gonna
you presented. That's really nice.
I'm gonna try and avoid getting too much into the weeds on certain things, but
this is the information age.
yeah, this session will be probably a bit more theoretical. But there'll be a lot more application to come out of the sessions in October, November, and December. So
okay.
I see Doug and Kara have joined us. I think we had 14 or 15 people that had signed up. So we'll give it another minute or so and then we can get going. And Serena, can you confirm for me? Can you see my screen currently?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Good afternoon, Chris. I'll just give it one more minute or so, and then we'll get going. Good afternoon, Molly. Glad to see some people joining the session. Tracy's on with us now. Excellent. Okay. I suspect we'll have some more people still joining. Good afternoon, Molly. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So we'll go ahead and get this going. Just so everyone's aware, and I assume you would have seen the pop-up when you joined the session. I know there are a few individuals who wanted to participate. They could not for one reason or another. So we are recording this session, just FYI for anybody that may want to know that. I've also enabled live transcripts. So you should be able to turn that on or off as you wish. This is the September Resource of the Month session. It's focused on cognitive load, cognitive processing, and cognitive learning theory. This will be part of a 4-part session. We'll look more in depth at what's to come later in the fall as we get into it. I'm hoping that this will be a little bit more interactive. I don't necessarily want to have to just talk to you all for 60 minutes. I certainly can, but I'd like everyone to feel comfortable to kind of join the conversation. And so with that sort of spirit in mind here, just to kind of give everybody a chance to either come to the microphone or share in the chat. What's everyone's current favorite television show, or maybe what's your all-time favorite television show? I'll go ahead and kick this off. I'm pretty excited about The Rings of Power that just started on Amazon. I'm a big J.R.R. Tolkien fan. If I had my camera on right now, you'd see I have a bunch of his texts behind me. So that's my big favorite one right now. I'm looking forward to watching the new episode tonight. So anybody feel like coming to the microphone and sharing their favorite show? And if not, you can certainly share in the chat as well. Slow Horses. I haven't heard of that one, Tracy.
I hadn't either. A friend told us about it. It's really good.
I haven't gotten onto the Apple TV yet. It's crazy. There's so many different streaming services. It's impossible to keep up with everything. Murder, She Wrote, Mad Men. Oh, Stranger Things is real good, Kara. I like that one a lot. Big fan. The Good Place. I don't know that one, Chris. Excellent. And again, just to sort of set the stage, as you all might have questions, this is some deep content. I don't expect it to make sense explicitly the first time. I've been reading about and studying cognitive load for several years now, and it's abstract, it's difficult to understand. So as we're going through today, if you have questions, do please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or certainly post something in the chat. I've got that open and I'm looking at it right now. So, okay. So I mentioned earlier, and before I get too deep into this, I'm going to share a copy of the presentation in the Zoom chat. So have it open and look at it as I'm going through it. You should have a PDF copy of the presentation now in the Zoom chat. But this is sort of our schedule for the fall term. And I know not everybody's going to be able to attend every session, and that's okay. We will be recording these sessions. Today, obviously, we're doing sort of an introduction, and therefore it'll be perhaps a bit more abstract. What we'll be shifting into, though, as we get into October, November, and December, will hopefully be more tangible, actual strategies that you all can use in the classroom. The goal here is really to get into the habit of teaching in a way that gels with how humans actually learn. You can work really hard to teach, and sometimes that message falls flat. And sometimes that's simply because we're sort of fighting an upstream battle, where we're trying to teach too much or too complex of information. And no matter how many tools or technologies we use, or how many fancy teaching techniques we use, if we're not teaching in a way that sort of gels with how the human mind works, you're fighting an upstream battle there. So today we're really laying the foundation for future months. But the long-term goal here is to add some techniques to your teaching toolkit. What strategies can you use or can you teach with that align with how humans actually learn? So away we go. A lot of this comes out of this textbook that you see on the screen. It's E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. It's written by Clark and Mayer. Richard Mayer is a favorite academic of mine. I believe he's out of UC Berkeley. It's a really fantastic text because I think it does a good job of taking this complex concept and breaking it down into sort of more manageable chunks. Really, today's session is sort of reiterating some of the points from some of the early chapters in the text. I do have here a link, a permalink for a copy of the text from the OU library. So if you're interested in the book, you want to read more about it, it's available through the OU library. You should be able to open it up via the permalink that I just shared. It's a pretty excellent textbook. You wouldn't necessarily need to read it front to back, but if you wanted to kind of delve into some of these ideas a bit further, a lot of what is coming out of this presentation has to do with what's in that book. So here are today's topics and the associated learning outcomes. We're going to start by talking about what learning is. The hope would be that you can walk away from this session with some sort of working definition of learning. I understand that you all as instructors probably have some sort of definition of learning already in mind. So maybe this gives you an opportunity to tweak your definition, evolve it. Then we're going to shift gears. We're going to look at some metaphors for learning. And this really gets us into this idea of how has learning theory evolved over time to where we are today. And that gets us into the knowledge construction view of learning, which is something that Mayer draws heavily on as he starts to develop some or share some of these strategies that he's done a lot of experiments on. Really, again, with that idea of how do we improve learning overall. So we're going to look at 3 such metaphors, kind of hopefully give you all a sense of why the knowledge construction view of learning is the one that we want to lean upon as we're trying to identify the strategies that should hopefully help learners achieve the goal of whatever lecture they may be currently in. We want to look at principles and processes of learning. That's kind of heavy. There's a chart that you'll see in a little while. I'll walk you through it. Hopefully it'll make a bit more sense. It's going to be a little overwhelming the first time you see it. And then we'll end this session with sort of an introduction into some of those strategies for limiting or for managing the limited cognitive processing that we have. So you probably all know that there's significant limitations on working memory or short-term memory. So we'll delve into that a little bit today and sort of set the stage for what's to come in the future months. So starting with our first learning outcome, what is learning? One of the goals of this session is to develop, again, a working definition of what learning is. So with that in mind, here's another opportunity for you all to either come to the microphone or feel free to type something in the chat, but go ahead and just take a minute or so, reflect on what you think learning is. If you feel like sharing on the microphone, please feel free to unmute yourself and share. Otherwise, you're welcome to share your short definition in the chat. It is hard to define, isn't it, Tracy? It's probably not something we think too much about. Acquiring new knowledge. Yeah, so a lot of this idea of sort of acquiring new knowledge, new skills, absolutely, that's a part of it. How that is accomplished, Molly sort of touches on it, could be through various forms. Chris sort of stretches upon that too, and it's not only taking in new information, how do we stretch that into maybe perhaps greater understanding? So yeah, I think we're sort of hitting all around the mark here. Let's look at how Clark and Mayer define it in their text. They sort of break it down into 3 parts. So the first part is, and a lot of us sort of, we're getting toward this, is learning involves a change. That change is what the learner knows or what the learner can do. And it's basically a consequence of some thing that they did, some experience that they had. So I think if we sort of take this all together, the working definition that they really provide is that learning is a change in knowledge or skills as a result of some experience. Now, primarily the experience that we're referencing here are the lectures that you all are leading for students. But of course, students are also gaining knowledge via lab work, self-directed learning, team-based learning, etc. Being that we're sort of focusing on the lecture component of learning here, though, and as you're going to see as we get further into the presentation, we're going to really focus on intaking new information through 2 principal channels, that being a visual channel, so things that we see, and an auditory channel, things that we hear. Of course, there are other ways that we can intake information. We have other senses. But primarily in a lecture setting, we're going to see that new information is processed through those 2 channels. So kudos all for your definitions. I think we were all around the mark there. That definition, though, does lead to some questions. Since a change in knowledge is something that happens internally, we can't directly measure that change. So we need to infer that learning is happening by observing a change in someone's behavior. So for you all, when you're teaching, what are some changes in behavior that you're looking for in the classroom? And again, go ahead and take a moment to think about this, and feel free to share in the chat. Again, what are some of those changes in behavior you're looking for to kind of give you a sense of whether or not students are getting it?
I can start.
Yeah, please.
One of the things that a lot of instructors struggle doing virtually is because they get no sense of what students understand or not, because they're not seeing them. And when I lecture in person, or when I'm working with students in the lab, I get immediate feedback based on their facial expressions, what they tell me and what their body language shows me, that they understood the concept or not.
Yeah, so you're sort of beating me to the punch here, Molly. But yeah, first of all, I think you're right that it's pretty standard for instructors to kind of observe the body language, observe facial expressions, those two things that you definitely mentioned there, to get a sense of whether or not students are getting it. Tracy says too, correctly answering formative questions. So a good point there too is, if you're not integrating formative questions during your presentation, and ideally, you'd want to see those sort of spread out equitably throughout the presentation and not just at the end. Because if it's clear 15 minutes into the lecture that, students aren't getting a particular concept, and you're going to be spending the next 45 minutes of the same lecture sort of building upon that content, it's going to be very difficult for them to be beneficial. Akshata says, understanding the application. Molly, you got sort of ahead of me here, is, observing changes in behavior is more difficult when we can't directly interact with students, so when they are online or when they are participating asynchronously, you're not even watching the lecture at the same time that it's actually happening. How do you adjust your observations for students that are not in the room? Do you adjust them? So what steps are we taking to ensure that the students that aren't participating synchronously, whether in person or online, what are we doing for them? So certainly you want to pair educational content with opportunities for students to self-assess their learning. That's not really the focus of this session, but it's something that we can talk about, certainly as needed, but definitely in future sessions as well. So another question to sort of ask yourself is, what do you do during teaching to observe such changes in behavior and knowledge? I think the take-home point here is that we want to infer that learning is happening as it's happening. So make sure that you're giving your students opportunities to reflect upon, to be active. What is it that I'm learning? Do I really have this or not? If you find that, in a live session, you're not getting that benefit of facial expressions, you're not getting that benefit of body language, are you at least giving students an opportunity to answer questions and go, yeah, I've got this, or no, I really don't, and I need to either raise my hand or seek out some additional support in that manner. Any questions before we move on? If not, then sort of our first take-home point from this first section of the presentation then is that learning involves a change in knowledge or skills, and it's a result of some experience that students have undertaken. So our next section is really focused on those three metaphors of learning. Again, this comes right out of the Clark and Mayer text. So I'm going to put three sort of definitions or these three metaphors for learning on the screen. And I want you all to read them, think about them, and let me know, in the chat, which one do you agree with most? So I'm not going to read them all. I'll put them all on the screen. Take a moment to read them. And then in the Zoom chat, go ahead and type the number that correlates with the metaphor that you most agree with? So seeing a lot of threes. Akshata's indicating that it could be a combination of all three. So really what these metaphors sort of align with, in my opinion, is, yeah, I thought that too, Tracy. The first time I read this, I thought, clearly it's the long one, right? It's got to be the long one that's more built out. It's clearly the correct answer. Really what these refer to, in my opinion, as I read the Mayor text first time many years ago and more recently, is that these sort of align with the evolution of learning theory that has happened over the last 100 to 150 years. So when you look at sort of that first metaphor, number one, that learning involves strengthening and weakening incorrect responses. You'll notice that I have a picture of a dog there. That's not by accident. Perhaps some of you have heard of Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian learning scientist who noticed that dogs would salivate, when food was brought into the room. And over time, through the process of classical conditioning, he was able to get dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. The idea was basically that he would begin to associate the bell with food. And so basically, he was showing that you could strengthen a response, salivation, through some sort of prompt. In this case, it was a bell. Okay. And that is a very rudimentary form of learning. The dogs did learn to salivate for a different stimulus, but it's not very complex and it's not necessarily applicable in all situations. But I think, as many of you know, I have 3 young children. Some of what they learn happens through classical conditioning. They just, my wife and I are very regimented. We have a schedule. We like to stick to it. It's important to us. And so, if 5:30 rolls around and my middle child she's ready to eat, man. If food is not on the table, she's ready to go. She has sort of internalized this idea that it's 5:30, it's time to eat. So let's get this done. So that is learning. I think, to kind of get into what Akshata was saying, all of these are learning in a way. Number 2, this idea that learning involves adding new information to your memory. And here we see a picture of an empty glass, and it's really this empty vessel idea that humans or learners are simply just this empty vessel waiting to be filled with knowledge. And I don't have a specific learning theory that I would tie to this per se, but you've seen this, through the evolution of learning theory, that humans, they're just empty. We can fill them up with knowledge, and that's how learning happens. You just have to throw enough knowledge at them enough times and eventually it'll stick. And again, I think we all know that, if you do throw something at somebody enough times, it will probably stick in some capacity. That's not a real effective means of teaching, and certainly not an effective means of learning. So we get to metaphor number 3, and Clark and Mayer spend much of the rest of the textbook kind of driving home this fact that learners have to be active in the learning process. And I think that's where you really start to see some of the difference in the evolution of these metaphors. In fact, we see that more here a little bit on the next slide. Here's sort of the 3 metaphors further expanded. The first one they call the response strengthening metaphor learning. And it's, again, that idea of strengthening or weakening certain reactions to experiences. The second one they call information acquisition. That's really that empty vessel idea. The third one then is knowledge construction. And they build this out a little bit more in this sort of table standing. And there's a lot of information on the screen here, and I'm not going to go through this all with you verbatim, but I think here what the key point is this idea that in the first 2, learners are very passive in what they're doing during learning, when learning is happening or when learning is supposed to be happening. in those first two metaphors, we really find that learners are not doing anything. The learning is just expected to happen to them. Whereas when we get into that knowledge construction metaphor learning, we see that learners are supposed to become much more active participants in the learning process. And I think what you would see then when you look just below that active part is that instructors, faculty, you all move from being dispensers of rewards and punishments. You got this right. Good job. You got this wrong. Bad job. And you're not just a sage on the stage. You're not just someone up there spewing facts at students for 55 minutes at a time. Ideally, what we want to see is more that you're a cognitive guide, that you're giving students chances, opportunities to actively engage with information, to actively engage with one another, and certainly to interact with you. And so you're that guide for that experience. Another sort of metaphor that I've seen for this is, you're the bumpers on a bowling alley. If the students start to go off to the side, you sort of bump them back into the middle. Or a GPS is another sort of analogy that I've seen where, someone takes the wrong turn and it's your job to sort of get them back on the right track. So the takeaway here is that we really want to make sure that learners are active sense makers during the learning process, and that if they are not being cognitively active, the chances of any meaningful learning to occur are actually going to be dwindled quite a bit. And sometimes it can be helpful to differentiate this idea that learners can be cognitively active without being behaviorally active. So that doesn't always mean that you actually have to have students like up and doing things. They get those opportunities, of course, in a lab setting or in various other settings. Certainly by the time that they get to Beaumont, they're doing a lot of behavioral activity, and that corresponds with cognitive activity. But in a lecture setting, they may be very cognitively active without actually doing much physical movement. So again, we want to get learners active during that learning process for learning to really occur. So again, we're here at sort of the end of the second topic. I'm going to just pause again briefly for any questions that we may have. And if nothing else, a pause is a good chance to get a drink of water. Okay. So now we move into the principles and processes of learning. And this starts to get a little deep. Please stop me if something doesn't make sense. I'm going to go through this at a pace that hopefully isn't too slow, but also isn't too quick where things don't make sense. So we start to see this interaction or this overlapping series of concepts. So I'm using colors to try and differentiate what these things are. So we really have sort of three stages of memory that come into play when learning is happening. So we have sensory memory, we have working memory, and we have long-term memory. I actually have a video coming out on this very, very shortly. It'll either go out today or on Monday. But sensory memory is ubiquitous. It's ever present. We are constantly perceiving the world around us. And sensory memory is not limited to just sight or sound. We also perceive the world through smell. We perceive the world through touch. But again, when we're talking about sort of the multimedia presentations that are happening in a classroom setting, those are generally more so restricted to, again, what are we seeing? What are we hearing? But the take-home point regarding sensory memory is it's really anything that we perceive. There's constantly things going on around us. A lot of what we process through sensory memory, if you could even call it that, is almost immediately flushed out of the system because we determine things to not be important or not currently important. And then as you shift things from sensory memory into working memory, that's really where you get into more of these processes and principles that dictate how learning happens. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. Clark and Mayer really identify three principles of learning. And again, we'll see these depicted on the next slide. This is sort of just pre-training for you. But the principles that they've identified are dual channels, limited capacity, and active processing. Dual channels is really this idea that again, in a multimedia presentation, we're primarily intaking new information through the eyes or through the ears. There's two physical channels through which we are processing information from the external world and bringing it into the mental world, what's happening inside of our mind. Limited capacity is really related to working memory, and it basically states that there's this natural bottleneck that happens. We can only actively process so much information at one time. So limited capacity and active processing play off of one another. And then, so what are learners doing during this process? It involves them selecting words and images, then organizing those words and images and integrating new information into existing information. So what does this look like? So we're going to start to see a lot of stuff appear on the screen here. I'm going to go through it one at a time, but anything that you see in black is meant to sort of refer to a stage of memory. The blue text that you're going to see is a principle of learning. Again, dual channels, limited capacity, active processing, and then learner processes are going to appear in gold text. So hopefully that'll help make sense of what we see on the screen here. We start with a multimedia presentation, some sort of multimedia content. And this wouldn't strictly have to be a presentation. This could be a video. So someone who's maybe watching this a couple of days from now, I don't know, hopefully you're not watching this on a Sunday, but you know, if you're watching a video, that's multimedia content, and it consists primarily of words and pictures. Okay, so this is really what we're talking about here. We process the information that's coming from a multimedia content through, again, two channels, dual channels, those being our ears and our eyes. Okay, so any words that are present, depending on the type of words they are. So we might have on-screen words. So that's text that appears on screen. We have to process that visually. We have to read it. But words also exist in a multimedia presentation through spoken words. So what I'm saying to you now, that's obviously spoken words. That's processed through the ears. Whereas pictures, on the other hand, those are solely processed through the eyes. So anything that we see on screen, words or pictures, that's obviously being processed through the eyes. So those are the two channels through which we process external stimuli and bring them into sensory memory. Okay, and again, we're perceiving a constant bombardment of stimuli. There's all these things that are happening, and ideally, you know, students in a learning setting are paying attention to like the core information, but we all know, we've all been learners, we all are learners. You know, if the room is too cold, if we're hungry, if we're thinking about some show that we're watching later that we're really excited about, those are things that are happening that are actually detracting from learning. So we as instructors, of course, want to try and minimize some of those things to the extent possible. So here we move into working memory. And this gets us to that idea of limited capacity. So again, the idea with limited capacity is that within working memory, we as humans face some pretty severe limitations when it comes to how much information we can actively process. You probably have all heard of the idea of 7 ± 2. There's different theories on, you know, some people may be able to process more information than others. As we become experts, we start to chunk smaller sets of information into larger sets of information. So a common example of this is how we chunk phone numbers when we say them to other people or when we recall them. So if I were just to read out 10 digits to you all and then ask you 15 seconds later to recite those 10 digits, that's very difficult for us. But if I give you the number, I'm going to say my cell phone number. If any of you call me, I'll know why. But, you know, if I say to you 517-403-8774 and I ask you to recall that, that's different than if I asked you to remember 517, 403, 8774. Those are actually smaller chunks of information. We're actually better able to recall that because we're not actually recalling 10 individual digits at that point. We're recalling 3 or 4 sets of digits at that point. So phone numbers could be sort of a common example of how chunking happens and how experts are actually able to process more information at one time than novices, because they're actually chunking similar groups of information into these larger pieces. So here we see the first learner process. What learners are responsible for doing during a multimedia presentation is to select the correct words and the correct images. And as you'll see, as we get into some of the future topics in upcoming months, this really gets us into the idea of extraneous processing. And this is something that is really easy to get caught up in. Is we have all this information that we want to share with learners. We as professionals feel it to be important. But there's times where during teaching, an instructor will be kind of going through their process and they'll say, this is interesting, but you don't really need to know this for the test. Well, every time I hear that as an instructional designer, I'm like, it kind of always piques my interest, because I go, I get it. I understand why I'm sharing this information, but if I'm here telling students like this isn't important for the test, automatically I'm kind of asking, well, then why are we sharing that information? And it's not that it's not valuable. That's not the point here. But when we're presenting more information than students can actively process, we may actually be detracting from learning. And so what we'll see in sort of some of the future months is there are some techniques that you can apply to sort of limit the amount of content that appears on screen, or better focus students' attention. The goal is we want them to select the correct words and the correct images so that they achieve the learning that it is that we want them to achieve. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, if I'm going through this too quickly or too slowly, let me know. I'm not seeing anything in the chat so far, though. So here we get into active processing. And that really comes at the stage of once students have selected some content that appears on the screen, or some content that they hear you say, because remember, we're processing both spoken words as well as on-screen words and on-screen pictures in a multimedia presentation. Once students have selected some amount of content, it's up to them to begin to start organizing that into a coherent mental structure. So we're taking something from out in the physical world, a multimedia presentation, we're bringing that into our mind, and we're starting to organize it into a verbal model and or a pictorial model. And that is that idea of active processing. But we're limited in how much information can go into those models at any given time, specifically new information. Okay. And if students are successful in selecting the correct words and the select images, and then in turn, they're successful in organizing those into a viable, successful model, that's where we start to see this integration of prior knowledge. So in a presentation, we're presenting primarily what we would expect to be new information, although there may be some repeat information in there. But the goal of all of this is we eventually want that new information to fit in neatly with some pre-existing information already stored in long-term memory. Now, long-term memory is generally thought to be infinite. And so long as someone doesn't suffer from something like amnesia, or experiences some sort of brain trauma, we should be able to, anything that's stored in prior knowledge, we should be able to recall that information later as needed. And when we recall prior knowledge and integrate that with new knowledge, that process is called integrating. And as new knowledge goes into, you could almost have an arrow pointing the opposite way here that says encoding, because encoding is really that process of where that new information and prior information come together here. That all forms a new sort of schema, and it eventually ends up in long-term memory. And so we sort of build upon what was already previously known. We grow that. And again, we can repeat this process over and over and over to expand our knowledge over time. So ultimately, what we end up on the screen with is perhaps a rather complex looking image, but hopefully having gone through it in that manner, it makes a bit more sense. Again, I'm going to pause here. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stages of memory, any of the principles of learning, or any of the learner processes that are happening in this theory of multimedia learning? hopefully one of the things you're all thinking, I see there's a hand raised. I don't see, wow, yeah, please.
Thanks, Cody. So what do we think or at least based on your review of the current literature, what are the people proposing the time that takes from getting things from, current or the sensory memory to long-term memory?
Like, how long does that actual process take?
Yep.
It's a good question, Molly. I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer to it. I suspect it would come down to how long does it take? Well, so if you look at those learner processes, again, these things in gold, how long does it actually take students to select the right words and images? Well, depending on the amount of content that they're being asked to take in at any given point in time, that could make that process happen faster or slower. So if we are inundating students with lots of on-screen text or lots of images or flying through a bunch of slides really quickly, that's probably going to extend the amount of time it takes to get from sensory memory to long-term memory, because we're just overloaded with the amount of content there is to select. From there, obviously, we get into that idea of organizing the words and organizing images. And that is a process that is happening internally within the student. This is where they're really starting to be active with the information that they're presenting. They've not only paid attention to it, but they're now trying to actively process that into some sort of verbal model or pictorial model. And that, depending, I would think, on the complexity of the material that is that they're trying to understand, yeah, that may take quite a while. If it's something relatively rudimentary, like, the direction through which blood flows through the heart, that's probably going to be a little easier to organize internally versus a more complex idea like, I don't know, cognitive load, perhaps, more complex. And we'll look at this again here in a moment as we get into these different types of processing that happen. But essential processing, like, we need that to happen, but essential processing is really dictated by the inherent complexity of the content itself. So I don't have a specific answer for you, Molly, other than to say, I imagine it's a function of how much time does it take them to select the correct words and images, then to organize those words and images, and then to integrate it. I don't know if that helps answer your question at all, Molly, but it's something that I will write on my whiteboard here to look into.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. Yeah, I was actually wondering about this. If we actually know that, and if we somehow compress this time and get this working memory into long-term memory, I think as educators we have accomplished, because as medical doctors, hopefully they're keeping all of the things that they're learning in long-term memory. And if we're able to accomplish, I think, job well done.
Yeah, and this isn't all to say, no, thank you, Molly, for the point. Learning is not all on instructors. I think we know that, we agree with that. Like, learners obviously have a huge responsibility in learning. It's not good enough just to go to class, at least for most of us. Like, students are going to have to go to class and pay attention, but they're also going to have to review, and they're going to have to engage in additional cognitive processing after the fact, to really solidify what it is that they know. So it's a difficult question to answer. I'm curious to know if perhaps Mayor or some other academic has done some sort of experiment to try and determine how long did it take to get from this idea on a screen to, I've got this, it exists in my long-term memory. It's something I'll look into, Molly. It's a really interesting question.
Thanks, Cody.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so that sort of leads us to our take-home point for this section, that learning processes are subject to the principles of dual channels, limited capacity, and active processing. So again, previously we've identified that learning involves a change in knowledge or skill that's a result of some experience. We need learners to be active sense makers in the learning process for meaningful learning to occur, but that there are these principles that really have a large impact on how well those first two things actually happen. So let's wrap this all up. We've just sort of talked about this idea that we have a limited processing capacity. And again, I try to be intentional with the imagery that I include in my presentation. So what we see on the screen here is obviously an hourglass or a sand glass. And I've seen this sort of imagery presented before when it comes to talking about memory. You know, if you imagine sort of the top part of this hourglass as being sensory memory, recall, again, we're constantly perceiving the world around us, so much so that a lot of that processing is almost happening subconsciously. You know, and not until I stop and think, oh, it feels a little warm in this room. You know, yes, my body is aware of that fact, but I'm not consciously aware of that fact until I actually stop to think about it. So, you know, we can think about this top part of the hourglass as being sensory memory, and there's this pinch right in the middle, and that's working memory. And again, we have all of this stuff around us happening all the time, and whatever it is that we choose to pay attention to, that becomes severely limited, severely constricted. But once we know something, like really truly know it, and it enters into long-term memory, again, we get into that idea of something being infinite, and we can recall that for later. So again, just some imagery there to hopefully kind of as a take-home point of, you know, how memory works. So impacts on learner processing. In a perfect world, learners would go through the learning process and they would just get it, and we would never have to worry about it again. But that's of course, we all know that that's not how it actually happens. So there are these impacts on learner processing, some of what we can control and some of which we can't control. But what we find is that there's extraneous processing, and that's cognitive processing that does not support the instructional objective. It's often a byproduct of poor design, such as having too much text or pictures that are distracting, not really helpful. And as such, we really want to work to limit extraneous processing, because if students are paying attention to something that really doesn't represent what it is we need them to know, their already limited processing is being distracted further, so the likelihood of actual learning happening is pretty low. Next, we have essential processing. That's cognitive processing that's aimed at that mental representation that we want students to create. That consists mainly of selecting the relevant material, and it's again influenced by the inherent complexity of the material. So more complex concepts are going to require a greater amount of essential processing. And what we'll see again in future resource of the month sessions is that there are techniques that you can use. If you know that you're teaching a particular concept that is in and of itself very complex, there are some of these techniques that you can apply to help alleviate some of the drawbacks of the complexity of the material itself. So what we want to do is try and make content as manageable for students as possible. This sort of gets into this idea of the zone of proximal development. That's a Lev Vygotsky idea, that, you know, if something is within our zone of proximal development, we can probably understand it with some guidance, but that there are certain things that are so complex that we can't understand even with appropriate guidance. You know, we're kind of shooting too far. So we really want to manage essential processing. Finally, there's generative processing, and that's cognitive processing that's aimed at that deeper understanding of the core material. That really gets us into that idea of encoding and integrating. It consists primarily of organizing those mental representations, and then again, integrating that with pre-existing knowledge already in long-term memory. And you have to have generative processing must occur for any sort of long-term learning to actually occur. Okay, and what we'll look at in the future, in the months to come, are some strategies related to each of these: extraneous processing, essential processing, and generative processing. I have a slide coming up that'll talk about the specific techniques that we'll talk about. So that brings us to our final take-home point, that learning capacity is significantly limited for processing and encoding new information. So what's coming ahead? We're going to really start to delve deeper into these 3 types of processing that happen. So in October, we'll start to focus our attention more on how to minimize extraneous processing. And Clark and Mayer in their text have a number of principles that they go into detail on, and they've done experimental designs to actually show how these things come into play. And we'll take a little bit deeper dive on some of those things. And the idea would be that you can walk away from any one of these sessions and actually apply the coherence principle to your lecture. You could actually apply the modality principle or the personalization principle. So in October, we're going to focus on strategies to minimize extraneous processing. In November, we're going to look at strategies to manage essential processing. And then in December, we're going to talk about strategies that foster generative processing. So we are done a little early today, but I wanted to leave some time for questions. So if you have any, now's a really great time to ask those.
I have a question, Cody.
Yes, please, Suzanne.
You are planning to give us some examples while you are, for the next sessions. Let's say how we reduce extraneous cognitive load. Are you planning to give us, a kind of hand-on examples?
Like hands-on examples. These will be examples that, so again, Richard Mayer, he is an academic, I think at UC Berkeley. It's one of the UC schools. So he has done a number, he's both an instructor and he does experimental design. And so he has done he's developed a number of these sort of tests, experimental designs related to each of these principles. And what you'll find is that I think they're straightforward enough to realize like, oh, here's an analogy of where I might see this play out in my classroom. So they may not be explicit medical school examples per se, Suzanne, but I think that we'll be able to, what I might try to do is where I see obvious connections and I'll say, hey, this was Dr. Mayer's experimental design. We'll look at that because there's a lot of in-depth details that go into like why it worked the way that it did in that experimental design. But if it's sensible to say, hey, this might relate to this experiment that we might see in, BFCP or renal or whatever course it might be, I'll try to draw attention to those where I see obvious examples.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I did post in the chat for anyone who didn't see it. Again, thank you all for attending. We're not done just yet, but I wanted to put it there before we lost anyone. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to provide some feedback on this session, I do appreciate it. So there's a Google form, the link to which is in the Zoom chat. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes to provide some feedback, I do appreciate it. It helps me make sure that these sessions are valuable and, determine whether or not we should do more of them. Are there any other questions on things we went over today or what's to come? Thank you, Akshata. Appreciate it. Yeah, if you don't have any questions at this point, or you're not, thank you all. If you don't have any questions, do feel free to drop off. If you think of questions, later today or into next week or beyond, feel free to get in touch with me. I think you all know how to reach me. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great Friday afternoon and a great weekend. Any last questions, Robin or Suzanne? If not, I can go ahead and just stop the session.
Thanks, Cody. It's a very nice presentation. I don't know what had happened in my laptop. I couldn't find Zoom actually. So-
No worries. I never want to
Yeah, no,
cut
no.
out before.
But
if I-
thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Absolutely. You're
Thank-
welcome, Suzanne. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.